Welcome to C2GTalk, a series of one-on-one interviews with influential practitioners and thought leaders to explore the governance challenges raised by emerging approaches to alter the climate. I'm Mark Turner, Senior Communications Consultant with the Carnegie Climate Governance Initiative, and I'm speaking today with Per Heggenes, who is CEO of the IKEA Foundation. The IKEA Foundation is an independent philanthropy focused on creating brighter lives on a livable planet. It's funded by INGKA Foundation, owner of INGKA Group, and is a multi-year supporter of C2G's work on governance. Before joining the foundation, Mr. Heggenes was the global head of corporate affairs for the shipping and logistics company Wallenius Wilhelmsen, and the UK president and CEO for the global public relations firm Burson Marsteller, and co-CEO for Europe. Welcome, Per Heggenes, to C2GTalk.
Thank you very much, Mark. Very happy to be with you.
Brilliant. Well, the world is facing quite a few crises right now. A continued pandemic, food and fuel shortages, rising economic hardship, geopolitical insecurity, and of course, a deepening climate crisis. I'd like to start with your work at the IKEA Foundation and its support for climate action. Given this challenging context, can you say something a little bit about your climate work and what are the values and principles that drive you in your funding decisions?
Absolutely. Well, as you said, Mark, our mission is really to create better lives on a livable planet. So we look at that as better everyday lives for children and young families living in the global south, basically. That's our focus. And as we worked through the years and learned a lot about what's going on and how we can make a difference, we realized that there are really two big threats that is faced by people living in the global south and young people growing up. It's on one hand the threat of climate change, and second hand the threat of poverty. So our grant making is really focused on those two areas and see how we can make a difference as a foundation in those two specific areas. And you know, the current context, although it's complex and challenging, and means that our work with climate action partners becomes more vital and more important than ever before, because you know, climate, energy, food, and health are closely interconnected. You can't look at them in isolation, but it's really interconnected. And people living in lower income countries are really the ones worst affected by these crises, whether it's the climate crisis, the global food shortages, and so on and so forth. So I think if you look at the global energy crisis, it really exposes us to how unsustainable our current systems are, and provides an additional motivation and impetus for us to decarbonize our economies and invest in renewables, because it's such an important part of making the world go on is access to energy. So, but we feel very strongly that that whole transition process will have to be underscored by a level of justice and fairness, so we can ensure a just transition. So they are not winners and losers, but there are all winners. And I think we can create everyone into a winner if you do it the right way. And we believe that if we're supposed to do that and we put our minds to doing that, we have to not do it in isolation, but we have to collaborate between other foundations, between governments, businesses, philanthropy, civil society, and the many people to create these changes.
So I'd like to touch on that a bit. What role do you see philanthropy specifically playing within the climate, in addressing the climate crisis, and how do you, as a part of the philanthropic sector, fit in with a wider ecosystem of governments, businesses, civil society? What are the mechanisms you use to work together and come to sort of some common action?
You know, what really drives me and makes me get up every morning is the fact that we have less than 10 years to drastically cut our emissions in half, and by 2030, and it's a very small window left to save the planet. And well, planet doesn't need to be saved, but we need to actually ensure the planet is livable. So I think philanthropy can play a catalytic role in this. I think the main thing is philanthropy has the opportunity to take risk, and philanthropy should take risks. We can take risks without any specific consequences unless we do it, if we do it sustainably and responsibly. So examples of that would be that we can de-risk investments in the private sector to actually accelerate and scale up investments in the private sector to improve access to energy, for example. We can help create ecosystems that allow business to focus and develop in the way business should. we can invest in developing solutions, new models, new ways of trying to be more efficient and more effective in how we provide opportunity for people to lift themselves out of poverty. And we can bridge the gaps between markets and policymakers. And we can drive collaborations, as I said before. We can set up structures that help people collaborate towards a better opportunity. We did that, for example, when we, back in 2014, invested in setting up what's later became the Women Business Coalition, which focuses on how business can help drive the world towards net zero. It's an example of really an unprecedented collaboration between business and governments and the financial sector and people, and such collaborations, in this case, ultimately led to the setup of science-based target, which is now the global, I would say, the key global standard for business to demonstrate how they can maximize their impact in reducing the climate impact that they have through their business.
Do you see any challenge inherent in the fact that unelected foundations essentially could dominate to some degree the climate debate and the ecosystem through their funding? And by the way, I ask this fully aware that the initiative I'm working for also faces occasionally similar questions. How does the idea of philanthropy and the amount of potential influence you have fit in with broader democratic practices?
Well, Mark, part of me says that I wish we could dominate this debate, because there's no more important debate to be had right now, you know. But I don't think we can, because as you probably know, somewhere between 2 and 3% of global philanthropy money goes towards climate change. So that has to increase dramatically if we're going to get to net zero by 2050. So, but we need to recognize that, of course, what you bring up is a valid concern. Having said that, we have no time to waste. So we need to push. And I think what foundations can do is actually give voice to the many, ensuring that it's not only one interest that's driving this, but it's the interest of the many that actually moves us together towards where we need to go. So we need to dramatically increase the contribution that we're making to tackle climate change, from 2% to 3% to much more than that. And I think as a foundation, we can act together with other foundations as a checks and balances system that make sure we all bring our different values and principles to the party, and we agree on a solution that works for everyone. And of course, we need to provide full transparency and need to be willing to be held accountable. But in my view, we as a foundation have no ulterior motive here. We only have a motive that's a secure and livable planet for the next generations.
And how do you measure success, including thinking about short-term versus long-term results, different kinds of impacts?
That's a great question. So I can speak for everyone, but if you look at how we do it, we try as a foundation to inflict systems change. Systems change take a long time, but the upside is significant if you can achieve it. And we do that by starting to understand what a theory of change, and understand our partners' theory of change, and try to sort of look at what is the impact we want to achieve, what is the outcome we want to achieve through our investments, and then we work backwards and see what does it take to get there. That means that we need to identify the barriers that are in the way of changing a system, and break down into investments that we make and interventions that we make in order to get there. So for us, this is about building a very strong, robust framework of monitoring evaluation around every investment we make, so that we have good measurable KPIs for every investment we make, so we can not only measure success, but also learn from the failures that we make. We take risks, so we have failures as well as successes, but we need to learn from the failures. And one way we learn from our failures is also to spend quite a lot on evaluations every year. So we take the most important interventions and programs that we have invested in, and we put a strong third-party evaluation around that, so that we and everyone else can learn from the mistakes we made and for the successes we had, so everyone can build upon each other's learnings. And by doing it that way, we hope we can be more efficient in how we invest in the future, but also how others can invest in the future, and scale the programs that we can't necessarily scale because at some point we don't have the funds to scale anymore. Then we will go and look for another challenge and another risk, and the scaling can happen with other partners.
And I'd like to touch a little bit on how you communicate about risk a little later on in this. But if I may, I wanted to turn to some of the approaches that C2G has been looking at. And obviously, the absolute priority now is to cut emissions and drastically scale back CO2 emissions. But the IPCC made it pretty clear recently that the world will also need to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere in order to achieve net zero, eventually net negative, and to keep warming under 1.5 degrees C with, I guess, limited or no overshoot. We've seen quite a lot of focus recently, this year in particular, on carbon removal solutions, both nature-based and technological. I was wondering if you had any thoughts on this and the debate that's getting increasingly active around the role carbon removal should be playing as part of climate action. How is IKEA Foundation thinking about these approaches, considering them? Do you see any risks that this could undermine efforts to cut emissions, create greenwashing, as some people would say?
Well, back to how you introduced the subject, I think our first priority will always have to be to drastically reduce global greenhouse gas emissions. And that should be our number one focus. Having said that, there needs to also be other tools that we probably have to reach out to in order to get to net zero by 2050. And knowing that, we also know that every option, including inaction, comes with a certain risk. We talk a lot about nature-based solutions, such as planting more trees. I mean, that's of course one tool in the toolbox, but we also understand that planting trees is not about planting trees. It totally varies the kind of impact you can have depending on the geographic context and the natural conditions. And so it's one of many tools. But I think we need to really guard against the possibility of significant climate altering technologies, because it's very early days. And I think we need to, instead of having that as an incentive to not do other things, we should motivate the governments and the businesses and the societies to do more than we do today to actually reduce the emissions before we talk about technologies like this. But they could potentially help reduce the risk of some of the climate impacts, but they bring their own risks, as you know so well, their own costs and ethical concerns. So I think policymakers need to address this in a much broader sense. We need to have equity in the decision-making. We need to have a governance structure. We need to have safety and accountability around this. So of course, that's why we support C2G, because you're working with governments and with international organizations and civil society to actually build the governance structure around this. So we know what we're doing. And if we do something, we do it together instead of individually out of desperation.
And just to be clear, when you mentioned climate altering technologies there, you were referring to the solar radiation modification as well as the carbon removal technologies.
Yeah, we have direct carbon removal technologies that we know work, but we don't know how to make it work at scale, and it's still not at the cost level that we can accept. So we have to, as Bill Gates would say, we have to get the green premium down. We have to sort of find a way to commercialize these technologies. But I get very nervous when I give you an example. A couple of years ago, I was at the World Economic Forum, and we had a debate around climate change and different technologies, and some executive stands up and said, well, I don't understand why this is a problem, because emissions should be a problem. We have technological solutions that can fix this. And that makes me very scared, because that points towards people thinking we don't need to really cut carbon and do the hard stuff because we can use it with technology. And that's really scary.
So turning to some of these other ideas that we're also looking at in C2G, to essentially, there are some ideas that scientists have put forward, given the scale of the climate crisis and the shrinking window of opportunity, to help lower temperatures by reflecting a fraction of incoming sunlight, known as solar radiation modification or solar geoengineering. You touched on the issue about governance before, and you're funding C2G's work to catalyze the creation of international governance around SRM, solar radiation modification. So perhaps you could just expand a little bit on why you think that that's so important, where you see the sort of risks and opportunities of creating a governance space there.
Well, as I said before, I mean, at this stage, we come so far in the global warming that we need to look at every option to stop dangerous climate change. But as you know, some options come with much higher risks and some options are less developed, and we need really careful considerations before we take those steps. I mean, some options could have huge unintended consequences, and we can't risk that we have a unilateral action by one country to stop warming because it's getting at a very critical point for them, because we can't geographically limit the actions that they might be taking. I think when you think about the scenario described in Kim Stanley Robinson's book, Ministry for the Future, when he describes this one country saying, well, you might not like this, but we are at the point where people are dying because of the combination of heat and humidity. So we need to do something, and they start doing something. Of course, this is science fiction, but it's also quite real in a way that it could happen that way, because those responsible for most of the emissions, you and I living in our part of the world, we will be the last ones to suffer. And those who have very little responsibility for the greenhouse gas emissions today are the ones to suffer the first. And we see that happening right now. And that's just going to get worse. So, I think about solar geoengineering like we may have thought about artificial intelligence and social media about 20 years ago. We knew it was coming, it came, and now it's extremely difficult to regulate, right? There's no way we are successful in regulating the Facebooks and the Googles of this world. You know, geoengineering could be even more challenging.
And one of the challenges, of course, it would have huge impacts for every country and every citizen on this planet. So one of the challenges is to make governance inclusive of as many people and groups as possible. What would IKEA Foundation like to see in terms of broadening the participation, including by young people, so a wider range of views and priorities are heard, and how might the world go about that?
I mean, we are funding you to help policymakers make responsible and ethical choices and how to mitigate and adapt to climate change. We believe that this can't be a process driven by scientists and experts. It has to be a process where everyone has ownership and every part of the society can contribute to this. We know that young people are the ones who are going to suffer the most from the impact of climate change. So involving young people in creating their own future is super important. And we're not having effective global and properly democratic controls. The geopolitics of possible unilateral deployment of solar geoengineering would be very frightening and inequitable. So I think this has to come up on the stage and on the agenda as a much broader discussion, not happening among specialists and scientists, but happening in the broader society. I mean, take the example. I mean, think about a country like Chad, for example, is 70 million people, 80% living below the poverty line, hugely impacted by the climate changes right now. The Lake Chad is drying up, you know, and that's gives all the fuel to their energy, to their nourishment. I mean, it's so important to them. So think about somebody coming in, business coming in, wealthy entrepreneur coming in and saying, we are ready to deploy a solar radiation mechanism and we are looking for a place to do it. So if we deploy the technology over Chad, your weather patterns will change. So would be very tempting to do. But as we know, I mean, we don't know about the unintended consequences. We need more insights and more knowledge before we can actually allow something like that to happen. But it could easily happen given that more and more countries and individuals get desperate over the impact that they're facing day to day from climate change.
Well, thank you. I wonder if I could ask you a little bit about communications, certainly something you're expert in. It can be obviously quite challenging to communicate about climate change in a way that people keeps them engaged, maintain a sense of hope and agency, but also accurately informed about the scale of the problem and the complexity of the problem, how to balance those two elements. How does the IKEA Foundation approach this?
Well, it's challenging because when you work in philanthropy, you experience on a daily basis this swing between hope and fear, because you have nothing insight into understanding how little time we have left. At the same time, you try to be optimistic. And every day we hear about poverty, we hear about climate change, about disasters, about displacement. But at the same time, every day we see how our passionate partners are working to change this. So this gives us at least hope that we can drive some systemic change in this. And I think that's what it should be. We should focus on hope. We shouldn't focus on doom and gloom. We should focus on all the opportunities that comes with a shift away from the fossil fuel dependence that we have today. We're going to see better health. We're going to see a cleaner environment. We're going to see healthier food. We're going to see increased job opportunities. Only communicating about the dangers of climate change could really lead to despair. So I like to focus on the positives and the positive impact that we will have as we go through this transition, that we change the way we actually deal with the climate change issue and opportunities that comes with them.
And I hope you don't mind, but I'd just like to pick up on one of the issues you raised earlier, just the nature of risk. I think communicating risk can be extremely challenging, how people can compare one risk against another risk. Have you had a sense of that being a particular challenge in your communications work, in how you communicate things? Do you feel that people inherently understand that there may be no risk-free pathways ahead, so you've got to find a balance between the two? How do we actually help people understand that it's measuring risks against each other?
Yeah, that's a really complicated subject, because most people will not have the time, the possibility, or the interest in getting deep into this discussion to really understand the different risks up against each other. And that's part of the reason we are really happy that organization, that C2G, actually is focusing on what they do and bringing a larger group of society into this discussion, because people need to understand that there's a very different type of risk when you talk about limiting the number of miles you drive with a car every day, or you switching to electric car, or you think about how you personally use less hot water, to actually start to think about geoengineering in the atmosphere. So I feel that communicating about risk is something that we have to do on different levels depending on who we are talking to. And I think the biggest risk that most people have not understood is how little time we have left to actually cut carbon emissions or greenhouse gas emissions by 50% in 8 years, and then get to net zero by 2050. I think very few people understand that 8 years is a very, very short time, and we have to make enormous progress in the next eight years in order for us to stay somewhere and close to the 1.5 degree target that was set by every country together in Paris in 2015.
So we've been talking a bit about communicating with others, but maybe I'll turn almost to a sense of communicating with ourselves or with yourself. I mean, it can be pretty tough working in climate change. I know that even the most hardened long-term scientists, experts, professionals can sometimes think, oh, wow, this is a big, difficult challenge ahead. So how do you personally keep a sense of hope, enthusiasm, while at the same time understanding that this is an extremely complex problem? What kind of philosophies do you turn to help keep yourself going on this?
We can't give up on the world, and if we stop focusing on doing whatever we can to limit greenhouse gas emissions and helping the world towards a net zero world, we just give up and can't do that. So I just get very impressed, excited, engaged, motivated by all the great partners we have that do really good work on so many different arenas and so many different situations to actually make the world understand better how we can not only fix this problem, but we can fix it quicker. And I get also motivated by the fact that this is a level of responsibility that I feel for myself. I belong to the first generation that can actually feel the impact of climate change. And I'm still also part of the only generation that is the last generation that can do something about it. So we are at an inflection point in my generation where I have to do whatever I can from my side. And it's just a privilege to be running a foundation that has focused most of its initiative, energy, and financial resources towards fighting climate change. So my responsibility is just to inflict the necessary change that can secure a livable planet for our children and our grandchildren. And I have no time to despair.
Well, thank you so much, Per Heggenes, for joining us on C2GTalk.
Thanks, Mark, for having me.